When you watch this flipped video, make sure you're looking for the answers to these essential questions. Number 1, what was the Seneca Falls Convention and why was it important? Number 2, how did women fight for their right to vote? Was it an easy battle? Please answer these questions on a sheet of paper and be ready to discuss them when you come to class. This flipped video is about the fight for women's rights. Today, we take it for advantage that all American citizens over the age of 18 can vote, whether they are male or female. However, this was not always the case. Women did not get the right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. This video will show you the struggle that women went through in order to get this right. For years, women made cartoons, drew posters, and wrote editorials about the unfairness of the situation. This is an example that shows why it was unfair that women could not vote while men could. If you look at this picture, it shows that women could be many things and not be able to vote. A woman could be a mayor, a nurse, a mother, a doctor, a teacher, or a factory hand. They could basically have any job, but yet they were not able to vote. But then you look at the men. The men could be a prisoner, a lunatic, that means somebody who's crazy, a man who owned slaves, a person who's unfit for the army, or a drunk, somebody who drinks too much alcohol. Yet all those men were allowed to vote. This is an example of a political cartoon that was drawn by a woman or a man who believed that women should have the right to vote, to show how unfair it was that while men could vote, women could not. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in 1848. It was held in Seneca Falls, New York. You can see from this sign, it was the first convention for women's rights. Seneca Falls is only about an hour and a half away from Buffalo, and it's a very important site in women's history. So in 1848, a group of women and men met in Seneca Falls, and they demanded suffrage. Suffrage means to vote. They also hung up posters like this one: "Women bring all the voters into the world. Let women vote." So many people met in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, asking for the right to vote for women. Seneca Falls Convention. The women's rights meeting took place in Stanton's hometown of Seneca Falls, New York in July 1848. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in United States history. It is often labeled as the birthplace of feminism, or ideas that women are equal to men. Leading the 1848 convention were leading reformers Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The final product of the Seneca Falls Convention was a document entitled the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments was based on the Declaration of Independence. However, instead of declaring independence from Great Britain, as the Declaration of Independence did, the Declaration of Sentiments declared women's independence from men. I'm going to read you an excerpt. Please notice how familiar it is to the wording of the Declaration of Independence. But after I read it, we're going to look for some differences. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. He has withheld from her rights, which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners, resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise." So let me go through some of this. I want to mark for you the spots that are different than the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal, and obviously this document adds "and women." The Declaration of Independence then goes on to list all of the horrible things that King George III had done to the colonists. This document instead goes on to list things that men had done to women. It says right here, "Man towards women having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. So rather than saying King George is a tyrant, this document is saying men are tyrants. And right here is the most important. He has withheld from her her rights and the right of franchise, and franchise means to vote. And if we look at the document, right here it says resolved, and that means, I put a star, you can't really tell it's a star, but resolved means we demand, we have resolved, we have decided that women are going to ask for the right to vote. Right here is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is the author of the Declaration of Sentiments and two of her children. And if you go down here, this is a statue, a series of statues from the Seneca Falls Museum. And right here, you might notice a guy who looks familiar. That's right, it's Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass was at the Declaration, was present when they were writing the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention, because he felt deeply that women needed to be treated equally, just as he felt deeply that African Americans needed to be treated equally. This is a picture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You see her name right here. And she is one of the women who was very influential in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. After the Seneca Falls Convention, different states started to allow women to vote. Women could vote in state elections earlier than they could vote in the federal elections. I want you just to look at this map, and we're going to look at some of the states and when they gave women the right to vote. Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869, Colorado in 1893, Idaho 1896, Utah 1896. Now I just want to highlight those states, so I want to show you something about these states. These are the states that allowed women to vote earlier than they could in other states. And if we notice something about these states, we notice that they're in the western part of the country. The reason for that is, in order for a territory to become a state, they needed to have 60,000 voters. And these states are very sparsely populated. They did not have a lot of people, but they wanted statehood, because once you become a state, you can get federal monies and you get a lot more from the government. So these states, because they wanted to become states, allowed women to vote very early so that they could reach their 60,000 people. And if you see, then it goes to the 1900s, and then pretty much almost every state was allowing women to vote prior to the 19th Amendment. Though women could vote in state elections, as I said before, it wasn't until 1920 when women could vote in federal elections. This is a picture of women, and they are protesting in front of the White House. They're holding signs that say, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" So they are asking the president, who at this time is Woodrow Wilson, to allow women to vote on a federal level, which would mean that every woman could vote no matter what state they lived in. Woodrow Wilson started to really listen to them, because these women were protesting for women's suffrage during World War I. And Woodrow Wilson started to think that the United States was sending soldiers to Europe, to Africa, to parts of Asia in order to protect democracy. Yet they were not giving half of their citizens the most basic democratic right, the right to vote. So we're going to see that Woodrow Wilson is eventually going to encourage Congress to pass the 19th Amendment. But getting to the 19th Amendment was not easy. You can see that women were often arrested for protesting. Women were beaten by police officers, and you can see these men are standing in the background laughing. This is a famous woman suffragette. She is in prison. And once the women were in prison, many of them refused to eat. They went on hunger strike in order to protest the way they were being treated. And they were forcibly fed. You can see this is an example. There was a picture too, but it was a little too graphic, so I showed you a cartoon. This man is just pouring food, like liquid, down her nose so that she can't starve to death when she's in prison. And he's doing that forcibly, obviously. So you can see that this was not an easy fight. Getting arrested, getting beaten, being thrown in jail, being force-fed. These are all things women had to put up with in order to get the right to vote. This is a portrait of Susan B. Anthony, who's perhaps one of the most famous suffragettes. She even dressed up as a man in order to vote and was arrested for it. And I just wanted you to read one of her quotes. "I declare to you that women must not depend upon the protection of man, but must be taught to protect herself, and there I take my stand." And you can see from the prior pictures that women not only could not depend upon men, but it was in fact the men who were abusing them in this situation, because many men did not believe that women should have the right to vote. And this is another famous suffragette, Alice Paul. She was the one who was in prison. This is before she went to prison, and she's leading a parade, holding a flag, and encouraging people to allow women to have the basic human right of voting. So finally, thanks to all the women at the Seneca Falls Convention and women like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was added to the Constitution in 1920. The amendment said, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." And that means gender. So there was no way, I'm going to put gender here. No state could take away your right to vote simply because you are a woman. And now today we all celebrate that women have the right to vote. I like this picture because it's probably from the 1950s. But it says right here, "Vote as you please, but please vote." So vote for who you want, but make sure you are voting. So when you think back on this video, think back on the women who made it possible for us to vote today. So now that you watched this video, you should be able to answer the essential questions. Number 1, what was the Seneca Falls Convention and why was it important? Number 2, how did women fight for their right to vote? Was it an easy battle? Please answer these questions on a sheet of paper and be prepared to discuss them in class. If you can't answer the questions, rewind this video, watch it again. If you find these questions easy and you're interested in the topic, please watch one of the supplemental videos that I've also added into this folder.